Hello to the world and to the kingdom citizens. I greet you in the precious holy name of Yahshua Messiah, Yeshua HaMashiach, who said in his word, John 8:32, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Hi, I'm Dr. John Curry, Ambassador, Pan-African, and welcome to the Embassy of the Kingdom of Heaven on Earth. If you want to follow this podcast, please subscribe to JC Global, Embassy TV 1, ring the bell, and hit the thumbs up button. Today I have a very important clip for you. It runs roughly about 26 minutes. And this clip is basically giving us an opportunity to see what's going on in the world as pertaining to reparation for Black people. Ghana's president, Nana Akufo-Addo, the president of Ghana, gave a very powerful speech. And this speech is about giving a worldwide reparation plan for all Black people. Giving a worldwide reparation plan for all Black people. I think this clip is educational. And educational means that you can take notes from this clip, you can learn from this clip, as well as be encouraged by this clip. In other words, God is still on our side, and if God be for us, who can be against us? Let us enjoy this clip.
For many, the slavery reparation is old-fashioned or impossible. That's because this topic has been made to sound so awkward that people find it hard that the Western governments will ever pay reparation. Well, if that was the case, why would the president of Ghana ask the Western countries to pay reparation while standing in the United Nations General Assembly? If this topic was old-fashioned and something impossible, a president would never waste his time talking about that. In other words, slavery, colonialism, and the transatlantic slave trade's reparations have become a debated topic now in the United Nations. The Ghana president did not stop at demanding reparation for Black people living all around the world whose ancestors were taken there. He further demanded reparation for the African countries who offered slaves to the Western countries, who developed and ran their economies. What more did he say at the United Nations that has forced the Western countries to start allocating budgets for reparation? Let's know about that in this video. President Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo delivered a speech at the UN General Assembly, addressing the lasting impact of the slave trade on Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas. He stressed the need for open acknowledgement, stating that it's high time everyone should openly recognize that a significant portion of Europe and the United States has thrived on the vast wealth accumulated through the labor, suffering, bloodshed, and horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. Referring to the recently published Brattle Report, it was highlighted that Britain carries an enormous $18.6 trillion debt in reparations, surpassing its annual gross domestic product by more than fivefold. The president underscored that while no amount of money can fully compensate for the atrocities, reparations would serve as a testament to the evil deeds committed, involving the forceful removal of millions of industrious Africans from their homeland and their forced uncompensated labor in the Americas and the Caribbean. President Akufo-Addo acknowledged the challenges in building prosperous and self-confident societies in nations whose natural resources were plundered for centuries and whose people were treated as commodities. Yes, he was referring to both the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism, and both of them demand reparation not only for Black people living in foreign countries, but also for African countries. He stressed the need to discuss reparations, pointing out that current generations are not guilty of the slave trade, yet it was a state-sponsored, deliberate enterprise that has left a profound impact on the economic structures of the nations responsible. In other words, the nations that once benefited from slavery are today standing because those slaves built their economies, infrastructures, and systems. That's a robust argument that the Western world wants to have an escape from. Earlier, in July, African and Caribbean nations united to demand reparations for slavery, convening in Bridgetown, Barbados, to devise a strategy for reparations. The meeting saw participation from institutions such as the University of the West Indies, the Economic, Social, and Cultural Council of the African Union, Barbados government, the grant-making network Open Society Foundations, and the Caribbean Pan-African Network. In August, hundreds of individuals commemorated Emancipation Day by marching through London, advocating for reparations for slavery during the annual African Emancipation Day, Reparations Day, march held in Brixton, South London. You should know that Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo has been repeatedly asking for reparation. Back in 2022, he urged European nations to provide reparations to Africa for the enduring harm inflicted by the historical slave trade. During a summit in Accra, the president stressed the devastating impact of the slave trade on the African continent and the African diaspora, asserting that slavery stifled Africa's economic, cultural, and psychological progress. He emphasized the pressing need to revive and intensify discussions on reparations for Africa, underscoring that these discussions are long overdue. In recent years, calls for reparations related to the damage caused by the slave trade have gained momentum, fueled by the global Black Lives Matter movement's pursuit of racial justice. Advocates argue that slavery left a lasting economic legacy that impeded the development of former slave colonies and the nations from which enslaved individuals were forcibly taken. Ghana, in contemporary times, served as a significant departure point for millions of enslaved individuals who endured the harrowing Middle Passage journey to destinations like the United States, the West Indies, and South America. European agents orchestrated the abduction of millions of Africans from the interior, trafficking them to coastal slave forts, including Ghana's infamous Cape Coast Castle with its Gate of No Return. From there, they were loaded onto ships and sold in the Americas, with an estimated 2 million slaves perishing during the Middle Passage. President Akufo-Addo drew attention to the fact that slaveholders in Britain, France, and the United States received substantial compensation when slavery was eventually abolished in those nations. However, enslaved Africans received no reparations. He also pointed to the example of Haiti, which had to pay reparations amounting to $21 billion to French slaveholders in 1825 after the Haitian Revolution, the first of its kind in the Americas and the Caribbean, which led to the emancipation of enslaved individuals. Akufo-Addo argued that Africans should receive compensation like victims of other historical atrocities, such as Native Americans, Japanese Americans interned during World War II, and Jewish people who received reparations for the Holocaust. He asserted that Africa, which saw 20 million of its sons and daughters lose their freedom and be sold into slavery, also deserves reparations. Furthermore, the president called for European nations to formally apologize for the trauma of slavery, asserting that the entire African continent deserves a formal apology from European nations involved in the slave trade due to the crimes and the extensive damage inflicted on the African population, psyche, image, and character worldwide. The Atlantic slave trade was the horrific act of transporting enslaved African people, primarily to the Americas. European slave ships dedicated to this trade regularly followed a route known as the triangular trade, which included the perilous Middle Passage. This disturbing practice spanned from the 16th to the 19th centuries. The majority of those subjected to the transatlantic slave trade originated from Central and West Africa. They were initially sold by West African slave traders, with the primary buyers being Portuguese, British, Spanish, Dutch, and French slave traders. Some individuals were directly captured by slave traders during coastal raids. European slave traders would gather and confine the enslaved people at forts located along the African coast before transporting them to the Americas. The economies of the colonial South Atlantic and Caribbean regions heavily relied on enslaved labor to produce commodities such as sugarcane. This was viewed as crucial by Western European states in the late 17th and 18th centuries, as they vied to establish overseas empires. The Portuguese were the pioneering buyers of slaves from West African slavers and the first to transport them across the Atlantic in the 16th century. In 1526, they completed the inaugural transatlantic slave voyage to Brazil, soon followed by other European nations. Slave ship owners considered the enslaved individuals as commodities to be transported quickly and cost-effectively to the Americas. These individuals were intended to work on plantations producing coffee, tobacco, cocoa, sugar, and cotton, as well as in gold and silver mines, rice fields, the construction sector, timber cutting for shipbuilding, skilled labor, and domestic service. Initially, the first Africans sent to the English colonies were treated as indentured servants with legal standing, similar to contract-based workers arriving from Britain and Ireland. Nevertheless, by the mid-17th century, slavery became deeply entrenched as a racial hierarchy. African slaves and their descendants were legally considered the property of their owners, with children born to slave mothers also considered slaves. These individuals were treated as property, viewed as commodities or units of labor, and traded at markets alongside other goods and services. The leading Atlantic slave trading nations, ranked by the volume of their involvement, included Portugal, Britain, Spain, France, the Netherlands, the United States, and Denmark. Many of these nations had established outposts along the African coast, where they acquired slaves from local African leaders. These enslaved individuals were overseen by a representative who operated on or near the coast, facilitating the shipping of slaves to the New World. Slaves were held in factories while awaiting shipment. The transatlantic slave trade resulted in an immense and still uncertain loss of life among African captives, both within and beyond the Americas. Estimates of this loss have varied widely, from as low as 2 million to as high as 60 million. The exact number of lives lost during the process of enslavement remains shrouded in mystery, but could potentially match or even exceed the number of those who survived to become enslaved. This trade had devastating consequences, leading to the obliteration of individuals and cultures. Historian Ana Lucia Araujo has emphasized that the experience of enslavement didn't conclude upon reaching the shores of the Western Hemisphere. Instead, it varied for individuals and groups based on several factors, including their region of arrival, marketability, type of labor they performed, gender, age, religion, and language. Scholar Patrick Manning estimated that approximately 12 million individuals entered the Atlantic slave trade between the 16th and 19th centuries, with about 1.5 million of them perishing aboard the ships. Roughly 10.5 million enslaved people reached the Americas. In addition to those who died during the Middle Passage, many more Africans likely lost their lives during slave raids, conflicts in Africa, and forced marches to the ports. In the Western world, slavery had become the engine running the economies. The southern United States, fueled by profitable cash crops like tobacco, cotton, and sugarcane, held a central role as the economic engine of the burgeoning nation. The engine powering this was human slavery. Had the Confederate States formed an independent nation, they would have ranked as the fourth wealthiest globally at the beginning of the Civil War. The slave-dependent economy had made a significant contribution to American prosperity. By the time the war erupted, the South was responsible for producing 75% of the world's cotton and generating more millionaires per capita in the Mississippi River Valley than any other region in the country. Enslaved laborers represented the most substantial investment for Southern plantation owners, constituting the bulk of their wealth. The establishment of a thriving enterprise in the untamed wilderness required a vast labor force. Through much of the 1600s, the American colonies primarily operated as agrarian economies, heavily reliant on contracted captivity. The labor force mainly consisted of impoverished, unemployed laborers from Europe who had journeyed to North America in search of a fresh start. In return for their labor, they received food, shelter, basic education, and occasionally learned a trade. However, by 1680, the British economy had improved, and more employment opportunities had arisen in Britain. During this period, slavery became morally, legally, and socially accepted in the colonies. As the influx of European laborers to the colonies dwindled, the enslavement of Africans became increasingly commonplace. With a favorable climate and available land, property owners in the southern colonies began establishing plantation farms dedicated to cash crops such as rice, tobacco, and sugar cane. These enterprises demanded ever-increasing amounts of labor. To meet this demand, wealthy plantation owners turned to traders who imported a growing number of enslaved individuals, with the majority originating from West Africa. As the number of enslaved Africans brought in increased and rising fertility rates expanded the available inventory, a new industry emerged, the slave auction. These were open markets where human beings were examined as if they were livestock and then sold to the highest bidder, becoming an increasingly profitable venture. By the mid-19th century, a skilled and physically capable enslaved person could fetch prices as high as $2,000, although the exact amount varied from one state to another. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The institution of slavery had become deeply rooted in the Southern economy, to the extent that not even the fundamental principle that all men are created equal could dislodge it. When delegates convened for the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, during the summer of 1787, they held diverse perspectives on the moral aspects of human bondage and the cruelty it entailed. However, they were in unanimous agreement on its economic importance. During that period, there were almost 700,000 enslaved individuals living in the United States, a population whose value would be worth millions of dollars by today's standards. The issue of slavery arose in discussions regarding the calculation of political representation in Congress. Southern states like Georgia and the Carolinas insisted that each enslaved person should be counted on par with the white population, a demand met with resistance from northern states. The compromise reached was to count each enslaved individual as 3/5 of a person, granting the South more representation. Additionally, it was decided that the prohibition of the slave trade would be delayed by 20 years, a concession to northern states that had already abolished slavery several years earlier. Before the American Revolution, tobacco reigned as the primary cash crop in the colonies. Tobacco exports surged from 60,000 pounds in 1622 to 1.5 million pounds by 1639. By the close of the century, Britain was importing over 20 million pounds of tobacco annually. However, after the colonies gained independence, Britain shifted its favor away from American products and saw tobacco as competition for crops cultivated elsewhere within the British Empire. Although tobacco had always been a challenging commodity for growers, susceptible to price fluctuations and vulnerable to weather changes, it also depleted the soil's nutrients. Nevertheless, as the importance of tobacco waned, another cash crop emerged with great promise: cotton. That's why slavery reparation becomes not only essential, but a moral obligation. For those who think reparation is not possible, it has been offered in the past. For example, reparation was paid to Japanese Americans in the past. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988 stands as a significant milestone in history, as it provided reparations and an official apology from President Reagan to Japanese Americans who had suffered unjust imprisonment during World War II. During World War II, over 125,000 individuals of Japanese descent, including about 80,000 U.S. citizens, were forcibly relocated and detained in 75 identified incarceration sites across the nation. These actions were initiated by President Franklin D. Roosevelt through Executive Order 9066, following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. Out of the 127,000 Japanese Americans residing in the continental United States when Pearl Harbor was attacked, approximately 112,000 lived on the West Coast. Among them, around 80,000 were Nisei, or second-generation American-born Japanese citizens, Sansei, or third generation, the children of Nisei, and Issei, or first-generation immigrants from Japan ineligible for U.S. citizenship. The placement of Japanese Americans in concentration camps was determined by their local population density and regional political considerations. Most of these camps were located in the interior of the West Coast. Interestingly, in Hawaii, where there was a significant Japanese American population, only a small portion was incarcerated due to martial law. Notably, California even identified individuals with 1/16 or more Japanese ancestry as candidates for incarceration. Executive Order 9066, authorized by Roosevelt, empowered regional military commanders to establish military areas from which they could exclude any or all persons. This authority was used to require people of Japanese ancestry to leave Alaska and specific military exclusion zones encompassing California, Oregon, Washington, and Arizona. Some individuals of German and Italian ancestry were also detained, as well as Germans who were expelled from Latin America and deported to the U.S. Before March 1942, approximately 5,000 Japanese Americans relocated outside the exclusion zones, while about 5,500 community leaders were already in custody following the Pearl Harbor attack. The United States Census Bureau played a role in these incarceration efforts by initially providing specific individual census data on Japanese Americans. Despite their initial denials, which they later admitted, the U.S. Supreme Court, in its 1944 decision in Korematsu versus United States, upheld the removals as constitutional under the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment. However, in the same ruling, the court established that loyal citizens could not be detained, leading to their release. Before this legal development, Japanese Americans were initially barred from military service, but by 1943, they were permitted to join, with over 20,000 serving during the war. Moreover, more than 4,000 students were allowed to leave the camps to attend college. Records from the camps indicate that there were 5,981 births and 1,162 deaths during internment. At the time, the incarceration of Japanese Americans was deemed necessary to mitigate a perceived security threat, despite their significantly smaller population in comparison to German and Italian Americans. Although some members of these larger groups were also interned, the scale of Japanese American incarceration far exceeded these efforts. In the 1940s, public opinion predominantly supported these relocations. In the 1970s, under pressure from the Japanese American Citizens League and redress organizations, President Jimmy Carter initiated an investigation through the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians to examine the justification for incarcerating Japanese Americans. In 1983, the Sewerix report, Personal Justice Denied, found little evidence of Japanese disloyalty at the time and concluded that racism had been the primary factor behind the incarceration. The report recommended reparations for the detainees. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 into law. This legislation officially apologized on behalf of the U.S. government for the incarceration and authorized a payment of $20,000 to each surviving former detainee at the time. The legislation acknowledged that the government's actions had been rooted in race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Ultimately, by 1992, the U.S. government had disbursed over $1.6 billion in reparations to 82,219 Japanese Americans who had experienced internment. Now, Black people and African nations want the same. In a united effort, African nations are re-energizing their pursuit of reparations from European countries for the transatlantic slave trade and other wrongs from the colonial era that occurred centuries ago. The transatlantic slave trade, a horrifying chapter that affected millions of Africans, remains the largest forced migration in history. Spanning over 400 years and impacting regions worldwide, it stands as one of the most inhumane episodes. However, the quest for reparations has been slower than many Africans had anticipated. President Nana Akufo-Addo of Ghana revitalized the call for addressing the historical injustices of slavery and colonialism. He emphasized that although no amount of money can fully heal the wounds caused by the transatlantic slave trade and its far-reaching consequences spanning centuries, it is high time to renew and intensify discussions about compensation for Africa. In recent years, some European nations that played pivotal roles in colonial atrocities and the slave trade have hesitantly extended apologies for their actions. President Akufo-Addo emphasized that the entire African continent deserves a formal apology from European nations implicated in the slave trade and the associated crimes that have harmed the image, psyche, and population of Africans worldwide. Reparations have long been a central focus of the African Union, and recent achievements, such as the return of pilfered artifacts and Germany's reparations payment of $1.1 billion to Namibia for colonial-era genocide, exemplify progress in this ongoing struggle. What's more, a recent report issued by the UN urged countries to consider financial reparations for transatlantic slavery, which has received substantial backing from activists and is considered a significant advancement. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres issued this report, stressing the failure of any nation to fully acknowledge historical crimes and address the persistent consequences of more than 4 centuries of mass enslavement of individuals of African descent. The report underscores the potential for financial reimbursement under international human rights law, provided it aligns with the severity of the violation and the specific circumstances of each case. Nonetheless, it acknowledges the formidable challenges in quantifying economic damages due to the extended passage of time and complexities in identifying those responsible and those affected. Advocates have lauded this report as a substantial stride in the pursuit of restorative justice. Bel Ribeiro Addy, the Labor MP and chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on African Reparations, described it as a noteworthy milestone in the global reparations movement. She stressed the significance of acknowledging the reparations claim, which has been a lengthy struggle by grassroots organizations. She pointed out that while those who were enslaved could not advocate for reparations, their descendants continued to grapple with the enduring consequences of African chattel slavery. What's more, a prominent UN judge recently stressed that the UK can no longer disregard the mounting demands for reparations related to transatlantic slavery. The judge urged the UK to alter its position and acknowledge the historical and legal necessity for reparations concerning transatlantic slavery. Now, slavery reparation has become a global issue, which has to be resolved. The countries who benefited from slavery and are today standing due to the slave labor must pay reparation. What do you think? Should reparations be paid to Black people all around the world and African countries too? Isn't it true that if people stopped demanding reparation, there would be a time when reparation would sound like a fictional idea? Let us know your thoughts on how the Western countries can be made to pay reparation without any delay. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.
JC Global, MSC TV1.